I'm very proud of this title. I don't know why. And I like sexy titles in this one. And I like alliteration, very much so. So words, and more words. Scott, I was thinking about you with that line. No. After hearing beautiful music, it seems weird to be talking about words, but maybe this all ties in. Phrase upon empty phrase, verbal, voluble gas, buzzwords, bad words, banal words, inspiring, invigorating, inciting words. More alliteration. Welcome to Sophistry 101. If you had the chance to read Plato, you'll know about Socrates' long-standing fight with the sophists. The sophists are masters of rhetoric. They're interested in one thing, convincing their audience. But as Socrates noted, they care not an iota for the truth. A Polish scholar acutely noted, quote, "The most prominent members of civilizations are saints, heroes, and geniuses. The most prominent members of anti-civilizations are heretics, dictators, and sophists. The most prominent members of pseudo-civilizations are trendsetters, entertainers, and public intellectuals." The internet is the land of sophistry, a land of sophisticated superficiality. So we have everything from Invermectin to Inuits, UFOs to underprivileged peoples, saints to sinners, transgender to transatlantic, Trump to Trudeau, Voris to, how do you say his name? Vigano, to Van Halen, popes to presidents. Layer upon layer of ill-informed opinions, buzzwords, and divisiveness. All of this highlights the danger of words, and all of this calls out for silence. Be still and know that I am God, writes the psalmist. Now, we should all contemplate Cardinal Sarah's insightful and challenging book, The Power of Silence. Sarah writes, "God is silence, and this divine silence dwells in man. In God, we are inseparably bound up with silence." Yet, replete silence is but only one side of the story. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. We have beheld his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father. We are people of the Word, capital W. And I don't mean bibliophiles or bibliolaters. I mean we're people of the Logos, of the God-man, Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the Word of the Father. The Son, as Joseph Ratzinger puts it, is the dialogos, the one who converses, the one through whom the cosmos comes forth, a cosmos fashioned by the Logos. Word is everywhere fathering forth. In fact, this is what Sarah is getting at. Silence is a type of word. In silence, God speaks. Silence itself is one of God's languages, and so are cell phones. This was a message from on high. Tonight's talk, however, is not about the silent speech of God, as important and necessary as that topic is. I'm far too garrulous to talk about silence. Rather, I want to explore the meaningfulness of words. And here, as a side note, I must say that when words are meaningful, I think they actually lead back to silence. Tonight, I want to steal words back from the sophists, and I'll do this following the lead of C.S. Lewis, a great wordsmith and a lover of truth. So, turn this thing on or off. Lewis loved words. He loved the sound of words, and he insisted that poetry should be read aloud, as most things should be. In fact, he has this. There's stories about C.S. Lewis that he had this incredible memory, but it was an auditory memory. So he didn't have this photographic memory, but he had this way of hearing things. And the legend is, I don't know if it's true, but when people go back to his room, he'd sit with them, and they could pull any book from the shelf and start reading, and he could finish the sentence. Not always bang on, he'd usually make it sound a little nicer. Sound of words. He loved the word also, the logos. In the same way that the term logos implies not only word but meaning and truth, Lewis argued that words carry reality, and when words change, our reality is affected. He writes, let's see if this works. Yeah, there it is. What is the good of deepening a word's connotation if you deprive the word of all practicable denotation, that is, literal meaning? Words as well as women can be killed with kindness. Men do not long continue to think what they have forgotten how to say. And Lewis was concerned that we live and breathe in a context that has killed words. We have so spoiled language that I cannot even say God bless you without pausing to try and explain that I mean the words in their literal sense. Okay. Now, before jumping into the deep, let's quickly look at Lewis's skill with words. Perhaps we could very simply say that Lewis was a translator par excellence. He was a gifted linguist. He could read French, Italian, German, Latin, Greek, and Old English, and he dabbled in other languages as well. His high school tutor, affectionately known as the Great Knock, raved about Lewis's ability not simply to read texts written in ancient Greek and Latin, but to translate these texts. In fact, in this regard, the Great Knock, saw Lewis as a genius, and I'm using this term in its fullest sense. Kirkpatrick was clearly onto something. Lewis himself noted in his autobiography, "The great gain was that I very soon became able to understand a great deal without even mentally translating it. I was beginning to think in Greek. That is the great Rubicon to cross in learning any language. Those in whom the Greek word lives only while they are hunting for it in the lexicon, and who then substitute the English word for it, are not reading the Greek at all. They're only solving a puzzle." The very formula, naphs, means a ship, is wrong. Naphs, a ship, both mean a thing. They do not mean one another. Behind naphs, as behind navis or naka, we want to have a picture of a dark, slender mass with sail or oars climbing the ridges with no officious English word intruding. Little did the young Lewis know, and he wasn't a Christian at this time, that he would one day be using his linguistic skills to bring ancient truths to contemporary people. Something we see in all his work, from his academic monographs on medieval poetry and literature, to his novels, and of course, to his apologetics. Arguably, Mere Christianity. How many of you have read Mere Christianity? Okay. It's a masterpiece of translation, translating Christian truths into the common tongue, into the vernacular. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Lewis saw great value in the vernacular. He wrote, quote, "Any fool can write learned language. The vernacular is the real test." Few would disagree that Lewis was a master of translating reality into words. He was superabundantly gifted with a poetic sense of metaphor. With this in mind, let's turn to his classic Mere Christianity. It's all working. This is incredible. All right. So, what is Mere Christianity about? Well, Lewis says it's about the core of Christianity and what all Christians hold in common. He writes, "It is at her center where her truest children dwell, that each communion is really closest to every other in spirit, if not in doctrine. And this suggests that at the center of each there is a something or a someone who, against all divergencies of belief, all differences of temperament, all memories of mutual persecution, speaks with the same voice." Thus, he argues, what we get is not some bloodless Christianity, but the richness of common depth, what he calls the highest common factor, HCF. To be honest, I think Lewis's notion of the highest common factor is deeply flawed, but we can talk about that later. Returning to Lewis, before he can speak of the highest common factor, he must defend the possibility of being able to speak about Christianity, as if it is something that can be nailed down. In the preface of Mere Christianity, Lewis raises the question, which paraphrased is, what right do I have to define the word Christian? Or, a closely related question, may not many a man or woman who cannot believe these doctrines be far more truly a Christian, far closer to the Spirit of Christ than some who do? This is a pertinent inquiry, which raises the question about defining what Christianity is. Does Christianity concern objective content, or does it concern attitudes and behavior? Can Christianity even be defined? Contemporary culture all too often crudely utilizes an ill-formed and misunderstood form of what's called hermeneutics or interpretation, in which everything, because it needs to be interpreted, is relative. Flowing out of this is the claim that all definitions of Christianity are equal. A friend of mine once told me, I'm not kidding, he said, "You have no right to tell me what a Christian is or what Christianity is." Then he went on to claim that he is an atheist, an agnostic, and a Christian. Does this sound familiar? Perhaps you've encountered this. By the way, as you'll see though, this is not an issue of hermeneutics, as Lewis sets out. It's an issue of reason. So, can we or should we define what a Christian is? Lewis brilliantly responds by briefly expounding upon the use of the word gentleman. He points out that gentleman once referred to a person who had a coat of arms and held property. To call someone a gentleman was merely a fact, like me stating that Scott is Canadian, or that a professor is one who has a post at a university, or a bachelor is an unmarried man. However, over time, the word morphed into something new because of a shift in moral perspective. People decided that what is important is not the land and the coat of arms, but rather the behavior of the man. The man who behaves well, now he's the gentleman. To be honorable and courteous and brave, Lewis writes, is of course a far better thing to have than to have a coat of arms, but it is not the same thing. Worse still, it is not a thing everyone will agree about. Gentleman no longer gives objective information, but by being what Lewis calls spiritualized, the noun is transformed into a term of praise. Ironically, this way of seeing the term also changed over time. So, when I say nice things to my colleague Scott, which I do, it happens, I would say he's a true gentleman, right? We don't say gentleman anymore, he's a true gentleman. According to Lewis, once the term was spiritualized, it lost its meaning. In fact, the term now concerns little more than preferences. We call someone a true gentleman if he does something we appreciate. You're a true gentleman, Scott, for bringing in pizza. I don't know if you did, actually, that was Sherry, but we'll give it to you. Okay. Yet, do we not already have plenty of other terms to express affirmation? The result of this spiritualization is that the term gentleman died. It became a useless word. In his book, Studies in Words, Lewis gives us a little more backdrop. First off, he helpfully explains the purpose of language. You ready for this? This is so helpful. Jen's a linguist, so she's going to agree with me on this, right? Language exists to communicate whatever it can communicate. Oh, got it. Like, that's a lot of help, right? So we say, well, what can it communicate? Well, he says language has limits. It does not do well at communicating complex shapes and movements. I'm sure Mr. Lorney would be pretty good at this as an engineer. But you're limited by words, you know, and novels, right? I mean, when it gets too detailed in describing something, you kind of get lost. Nor can it do more than one thing at a time, unlike what we heard today in the choir. Multiple things happening. In that setting, we talk about a symphony. When it's a bunch of words, it's a cacophony. Like time, language is linear. Language is well suited to reason, says Lewis, and to inform. And my students never get this. I always ask them, what do you think it's good at? and what it's not good at. And they say it's terrible at expressing emotions. And Lewis says it's great at expressing emotions. He says this is what where it really shines. And the reason why my students don't realize that is because they don't read poetry, right? Who reads poetry today? Emotions play a significant role in human existence, and as mentioned, is also an important part of language. However, this can become a problem when it masquerades as something else. Lewis calls the reader's attention to the fact that there is a difference between emotional language and language that arouses emotion. Telling a friend that you have cancer or telling your wife that you love her are statements of fact. These aren't emotional statements. These are statements of fact. And it's the facts and not the language as emotional that arouses the emotion in the hearer. Is I love you emotional language? No. I love you is a fact, if I'm telling the truth. By communicating the fact, your wife will have an emotional response. And thus, Lewis reasons, statements about crime are not criminal language, nor are statements about emotions necessarily emotional language. Are judgment values emotional language? For example, you may have strong emotions of anger directed towards, let's say, your sibling, and want to inflict some sort of pain or some sort of frustrating experience on him or her, but recognize that this is bad. The recognition of good and bad are beyond what one feels. Or one more example. We can disapprove of an act that we find funny. You know, my kids start throwing food at home at the table, and then I'm trying not to laugh, and as you're chastising them, right? Now, turning to poetry, poetry is not mere emotional language. Let's look, or better yet, listen. Okay, here's an example. If you're brave enough, you can close your eyes. This is a famous poem by Lewis, one of his better poems. By the way, Lewis wanted to be a poet first and foremost in life, but he was a failed poet. That's why his books are really good. He's good with words because he's kind of poetic, but he wasn't really good enough to be a poet. But that's why we also read his literature, right? So this is called What the Bird Said Early in the Year. Jen was recently in Oxford, and you went down Addison's Walk, I assume. Okay, this is about Addison's Walk. It's a really important place where Lewis had a conversion type experience, and he walked there many, many times in his life. Here goes. If you're brave enough, close your eyes. I heard in Addison's Walk a bird sing clear. This year the summer will come true. This year. Winds will not strip the blossom from the apple trees. This year, nor want of rain destroy the peas. This year time's nature will no more defeat you, nor all the promised moments in their passing cheat you. This time they will not lead you round and back to autumn, 1 year older by the well-worn track. This year, as all these flowers foretell, we shall escape the circle and undo the spell. Often deceived, yet open once again your heart. Quick, 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 the gates are drawn apart. Now, maybe it's not as beautiful as the singing, but maybe the poem affected you in some way. How does that function? How are you being affected by it? And Lewis would say, well, it's the images that arouse the emotions. Okay? It's not because it's emotional language, it's these images. Hence, Lewis writes, poetry most often communicates emotions, not directly, but by creating imaginatively the grounds for those emotions. It therefore communicates something more than emotion. Only by means of that something more does it communicate the emotion at all. It's communicating reality. Returning to mere Christianity, by spiritualizing or deepening the word Christian, so for example, Sarah is a true, I need to turn it again. Sorry, I missed that one. Classic class, right? I always miss at least one of those. So for example, Sarah is a true Christian because she is a good person. if we do such a thing, the term Christian will become a useless word. Christian will come to be a synonym for American or Western or a decent person, someone who's nice and so forth. So then we have to say, well, what is a Christian? And Lewis replies, which I'm quite proud of him for saying this, he's bang on. One who accepts the teachings of the apostles, namely the Apostles' Creed. Lewis writes, there's no question of its being restricted to those who profited by that teaching as much as they should have. There's no question of its being extended to those who in some refined spiritual inward fashion were far closer to the Spirit of Christ than the less satisfactory of the disciples. So, what then do you call one who accepts the doctrines of Christianity but does not live accordingly? Well, to use words well, Lewis would say, a bad Christian, or an unfaithful Christian, or Judas. Okay? So, but you don't call them not a Christian. He says, now you're not understanding terms. In the vein of spiritualizing the word Christianity, it is not uncommon to have people say, I am a Christ follower, or I'm a Jesus lover. This is deeply problematic. I get this all the time. My Trinity Western students, this is what they want to say because Christianity has bad connotations for them. So they'll say, well, I'm a Jesus lover. I'm a Christian. Or I'm not a Christian. I'm a Christ follower. And this is really problematic because it says nothing objective, or at least not clearly objective. Do you follow Jesus in the manner of the Latter-day Saints? Do you follow Jesus as a Muslim, as a Jehovah's Witness, as an anthroposophist? Do you follow Jesus like Gandhi did? Or like Hindus do? Or like the great novelist Dan Brown? You know, which flavor? Or do you follow him in your own manner? And thus not faith, but narcissism, religion of the self, spirituality. When asked about their faith, a Catholic is prone to say, Catholic, not Christian. And I remember before I was Catholic, I thought, these people surely are not Christian. This is a sign of it, right? But actually, I think there's something really astute. I don't think most Catholics think about it, but it's a really good way of being clear. This is a good, as Lewis would say, this is a good use of words. It's an objective statement. As set out previously, Lewis said, men do not long continue to think what they have forgotten how to say. Words matter. Christianity is an objective reality. When I say I am Catholic, this is objective meaning. When language is used properly, the term informs us of something. When I say I'm a Catholic, it informs my dialogue partner that I'm obedient to my bishop, to my pope, to the teachings of the magisterium, all of which are historical incarnations of our Lord. As long as the term has an objective meaning, it spurs emotions and it causes value judgments, whether positive or negative or good or bad. Okay, now we come to the difficult part. Anyone ever tried reading The Abolition of Man? It's not an easy read. Highly recommend. There's one of the most famous, he died a few years ago, he's dead. One of the most famous philosophers of the 20th into the 21st century, friend of Joseph Ratzinger's, is a guy named Robert Spemann. He made every single one of his students, his graduate students, read The Abolition of Man. He said it's the most important philosophical text of the 20th century. So I encourage you to read it. It's really hard to read. Michael Ward has a great book called After Humanity, where he unpacks the significance of it. Fantastic book. I encourage you to pick it up. Or pick up Michael Ward's other great book called Planet Narnia. And he's not paying me for this, but maybe I will send him an email later telling him he should. So here we go. I'll try and unpack this in a simple way. And this all connects with words. Lewis defends nouns being objective against them becoming statements of value. Not because values are a problem, but because we have plenty of value words. And if we keep turning objective nouns into values, we'll have nothing left to give a value. It's kind of strange also to give value to values. In fact, he argues that value must correspond with objective reality. And there's an interesting shift that takes place if we follow the logic of much secular modernity. That is, it makes all values relative, effectively making all values meaningless. If Christianity can be reduced to a value rather than an objective thing, as C.S. Lewis described it, then it becomes relative, and therefore it becomes meaningless. Lewis seeks to defend not only the objectivity of nouns, such as Christianity, but also the objectivity of values. So, Abolition of Man. This very dense and important book finds its springboard, its inspiration, in a text that was sent to him for review. Lewis was known to be a very generous reviewer. He had bad experiences with people and learned that you need to be kind to people. So instead of being generous to the book that he completely lambasts, he just changes the names of the authors and the title of the book. All right. He refers to it as the Green Book, and he gives the authors the pseudonyms Gaius and Titius. The book was actually titled, now we know, so now we can laugh at these people. No. The book was actually titled The Control of Language and was written by Alex King and Martin Ketley. But as Michael Ward points out, the real book and the authors don't really matter. It soon became clear, writes Ward, that the Green Book is a foil, a useful opponent against which Lewis can swiftly establish his anti-subjectivist case by means of contrast. Lewis begins by reflecting on the author's retelling the famous story about Coleridge and the waterfall. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. But since you're not, here's what he says. You remember that there were two tourists present, right? Yeah, you remember? Yeah, okay, good. That one called it, the waterfall, sublime and the other pretty, and that Coleridge mentally endorsed the first judgment and rejected the second with disgust. Gaius and Titius comment as follows. When the man said, "This is sublime," he appeared to be making a remark about the waterfall. Actually, he was not making a remark about the waterfall, but a remark about his own feelings. What he was saying was really, I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime. Or shortly, I have sublime feelings. Here are a good many deep questions settled in a pretty summary fashion. But the authors are not yet finished. They add, this confusion is continually present in language as we use it. We appear to be saying something very important about something, and actually we're only saying something about our own feelings. So, Lewis interjects, and he says, look, the waterfall is either sublime or it's pretty, but it's not both. Coleridge rightfully asserted that it is sublime. Gaius and Titius are clearly wrong when they assert that this remark is not about the waterfall, but is really about the feelings of the observer. I have sublime feelings. An interesting side note, by the way, is that another book of his called An Experiment in Criticism, Lewis highlights that one is much quicker to share his or her opinion than to provide adequate description about reality. It's really hard to do it, right? So for example, it's much easier for me to say, and I probably do this in class all the time, I like food. I really like that cappuccino. That's easy to say, rather than the delicate balance of warm milk and the bubbly foam with the sharp taste of dark espresso perfectly offsets the sweetness of that 90% dark chocolate that went with it. Okay, is this because we're actually afraid to talk about what is? Or is it that we're confused about the difference between our own feelings and the reality that pervades our lives? Now, Lewis wastes little time responding to Gaius and Titius and their asinine notion. Showing the absurdity of it, he writes the following. The emotions which prompt the projection, the waterfall is sublime, or the correlatives, and therefore almost the opposites of the qualities projected. The feelings which make a man call an object sublime are not sublime feelings, but feelings of veneration. If one wanted to reduce the experience of the waterfall to the speaker's feelings, the proper statement would be, I have humble feelings. The waterfall is sublime, which therefore correctly arouses feelings of veneration. We venerate because it is sublime. Okay? Objective, real. And here is the difficulty of the argument set out by Lewis. You are contemptible means when I say that, you're contemptible, means I have contemptible feelings. In fact, that your feelings are contemptible means my feelings are contemptible. In other words, if Gaius and Titius are correct, I'm stuck within the solipsistic self. All I ever say in regards to value only concerns me. You are contemptible is not a statement about another person, but a mere reflection of my feelings which have no correlation to anything. So for example, if I were to tell someone, I hate you, it'd be no different than saying, I appreciate you. Because the object or the person spoken to is not in relation to my statements of value. My statements are mere emotions based on nothing. And Lewis says, this sort of thinking leads to two things. One, all sentences containing a predicate value. So a predicate's that part of the sentence that says something about a noun, right? A beautiful and bold eagle. Are statements about the emotional statement of the speaker. I have feelings of beauty and boldness. And two, all such statements are unimportant. Feelings simply become mere feelings. All emotions aroused by local association are in themselves contrary to reason and contemptible. Furthermore, in relation to both points, all statements of value are meaningless. They have no correlation with what actually is, with reality. So Lewis says, last quote on the bottom there, until quite modern times, all teachers and even all men believe the universe to be such that certain emotional reactions on our part could either be congruous or incongruous to it. Believed, in fact, that objects did not merely receive, but could merit our approval or disapproval, our reverence or our contempt. By making value statements emotive utterances that do not reflect objective reality, we cut ourselves off from ever meaningfully interacting with the world and with other persons. Every utterance of value merely becomes my own verbal diarrhea, disconnected from reality and thus from everyone else's, or from everyone else. The world becomes my world, the world in my head, and I become an island, one of many, within the relativity of an immense archipelago of never-touching islands. In contrast, Lewis argues the following. Emotional states can be in harmony with reason, when we feel liking for what ought to be approved, or out of harmony with reason, when we perceive that liking is due but cannot feel it. No emotion is in itself a judgment. In that sense, all emotions and sentiments are illogical. But they can be reasonable or unreasonable as they conform to reason or fail to conform. The heart never takes the place of the head, but it can and should obey it. In other words, our emotions can be appropriate or inappropriate, depending if they line up correctly with what Lewis calls the Tao, or what we typically call natural law. At first glance, because we're so steeped in a subjectivist society, this may seem odd, that there's correct ways and incorrect ways to respond to things around you. But if I raise a few questions to you, I think you'll get Lewis's point. Should you mourn at a funeral, or should you be as exuberant and as happy as a clown? I've had an awkward experience of losing myself in laughter at a funeral. It's a terrible thing because you know it's not right? This is a moment of sadness. Should child pornography disgust you, or should it make you feel warm and fuzzy? Should your child's first communion bring you joy or anger? Certainly there are right and wrong responses. Sentiment can either be in line or out of line with reality. Whereas for Gaius and Titius, there's no connection between emotion and reason or fact and value. And on this view, the world of facts without one trace of value and the world of feelings without one trace of truth or falsehood, justice or injustice, confront one another and no rapprochement is possible. The logical conclusion of the subjectivist is that sentiments are meaningless and they must be removed. So think someone like Spock in Star Trek. Or they can be kept for no reason whatsoever. Lewis takes this notion and he shows the problems with it by providing the example of a Roman father. a Roman father in the ancient world, who's teaching his son about patriotism, that it's important at times to lay down one's life for one's country. The father could teach his son such an ideal because he actually believed it was a good act, a value statement based on natural law. And the proper response then is to embrace it. Gaius and Titius cannot say it is good, it's a value statement, and thus must debunk such a sentiment, or if they want to encourage patriotism, they must find a way to brainwash. In a word, the old was a kind of propagation, men transmitting manhood to men. The new is merely propaganda. For Lewis, sentiments are an important part of being human. And they can correspond to reality and are necessary to motivate action where reason is limited. Without the aid, he writes, of trained emotions, the intellect is powerless against the animal organism. The head, reason, rules the belly, the instinctual, through the chest, emotion, the spirited part. Sentiment, an expression of desire, or in Lewis's terms, trained emotions, work together with reason in order to direct human action, what we could call virtue ethics. Now, this chapter is brilliantly titled Men Without Chests, because without natural law, that is, without objective value, we cannot recognize that sentiments, the spirited part, the chest, can correlate with reality, resulting in men with great heads, great intellects, who are unable to overcome raw instincts. For, writes Lewis, without the aid of trained emotions, the intellect is powerless against the animal organism. The intellect needs emotions, needs sentiments to control our instincts. We're getting to the end here, don't worry. To conceive of sentiment as irrational, something disconnected from objective reality, no different than a burp or a hiccup, is to destroy the possibility of rational or irrational moral choice. If there are not objective values, then my sentiments cannot be rightly aligned to reality. And if this is the case, then all moral choice is arbitrary and baseless. Why? Because moral choices must be made in reference to goodness. And if there's no such thing, if values cannot correspond to reality, then choice is meaningless. Would you like the blue jelly bean or the blue jelly bean? Doesn't matter, all the same. From propositions about fact alone, says Lewis, no practical conclusion can ever be drawn. Without chests, metaphorically speaking, men are simply calculators who are swayed back and forth by their instincts. In other words, men are just really simply intelligent animals. Okay, to come full circle, it really matters what we say about the waterfall, or for that matter, what we say about anything. We can use words to express sentiment that resonate with reality, or use words that do not. If words cannot be utterances of truth, then all language is manipulation. So if we cannot say truth, then all language is manipulation. It's all power. However, if words carry truth and carry meaning, then we must be careful and learn to use them well. Our words should align with the grain of the universe. And here we go. This is it, the summary. Lewis takes words seriously. Words carry meaning, and we should not spiritualize or manipulate words. When we change the way in which we use words, we reshape our reality, making certain things obsolete and bringing to life new things. We must use words carefully, for they are laden with meaning. So, for example, in the abortion debates, those who are pro-choice wisely do not refer them to themselves as pro-abortion, because that puts the emphasis on killing the unborn. Instead, they have emphasized a key Western value, choice. Likewise, the church's position is referred to as pro-life rather than anti-abortion. Why? Highlighting the positive is far more convincing than emphasizing the negatives. Here's another example along the same vein. The NHS, the National Health Service in Scotland, put together criteria in the form of questions for helping gauge when, this is their question, when it is the right time, or I put this in question form, when is it the right time to have sex? Here's one of the questions. Okay, this is in their literature. Have we got contraception organized to protect against pregnancy? What does this say about human life? You have to protect yourself against a baby. What does it say about sex? And so forth. In contrast, we have the words of someone like Dietrich von Hildebrandt, who referred to the possibility of creating life as superabundant finality. That's a little heady, but far more beautiful than, the other words. Although we may think that we are injecting meaning into words by spiritualizing them, we're actually removing their objectivity. And here it's worth pausing for a quick moment to recollect that true spirituality is objective. That is, what is spirit is weighty and true. We do poorly if we obfuscate and obliterate the objectivity of words. By removing the objectivity of the word, we simply reduce it to a synonym for good and bad. In a little essay he wrote called The Death of Words, Lewis gives the example of the word modern, which no longer is a chronological term, but simply means good sense. But do we really need more words to express our approval and disapproval? Furthermore, as pointed out in The Abolition of Man, there are right and wrong words. What we say concerning values and sentiments either correlates with reality or it does not. Our sentiments, which we express with language, either go with the grain of the universe or not. If words of value are mere emotional utterances, mere verbal gas, with no relation to reality, then saying, I hate children is fundamentally no different than saying, I love children. Okay, and my last 3 lines to conclude with a punch. If words and sentiments do not obtain, that is, have traction with reality, then human beings are value-free animals, imprisoned by their own complex hallucinations. On the other hand, if sentences and sentience obtain, then it is of the utmost importance that we use words wisely. So, may our logoi, our words, reflect the Logos. Thank you.